We'd like to kick things off by hearing some additional reflections from Chancellor Pat Gallagher. As I indicated this morning, Chancellor Gallagher picked up where Mark Nordenberg left off in terms of his enthusiastic support and advocacy for this forum. But he's also built his own legacy of distinction as Chancellor. In his 9 years of stewardship of this university, Pitt has hit all-time record levels of success in the key metrics of the quality of faculty, students, and staff, fundraising, research productivity, the beautiful campus. And Pitt has now hit the upper echelons of the nation's most distinguished universities, and we credit both Chancellor Gallagher and Chancellor Nordenberg for making that happen. Pat will be stepping down next year. Hard to believe it's been 9 years, but we wish him great success and we thank him for his contributions to this forum. Chancellor Gallagher.
Thank you, John. It is great to be here today to kick off this long overdue but much needed celebration of Dick's remarkable life and the incredible impact he had. You know, those from the university have heard me say this before, but you know, there's a lot of ways a university tries to measure its worth, but there's only one that matters, and that's through the lives of the people who went here. And by that measure, Dick is a yardstick that few universities can live up to. His remarkable life was one of incredible achievement that touched every aspect of public life, from local to state to federal and even global. He touched on the issues of the day that both mattered to him and that he was forced to react to. But in my mind, the one thing that always stands out to Dick, and one of the reasons I'm so proud that he gave his legacy back to Pitt for us to honor and share and advance, is he was a man of deep principle and warm humanity. He was a great guy who did the right things for the right reasons. And I saw that in my interactions with Dick and the Board of Trustees and through the Thornburgh Forum. And it's, I think, the reason why we feel this connection to Dick that has, you know, transcended a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, a lot of years, a lot of issues, and has brought us back together for this celebration. The University of Pittsburgh is really proud to be one of the homes for Dick Thornburgh, Jenny, for you and for the family, for Dick's his archives, his forum that carries his name and continues to advance the ideals that he stood for. And I have to say, it's not delayed that we're meeting here today. It's actually timely that we're meeting here today. Many of the things that Dick was most passionate about are things that have never been more important to our democracy, to our way of life. And I think it's fitting that, you know, we are meeting here both to remember a great guy, but also to reflect on how important the things that he championed are still things that we need to be focusing. And I think Dick would want us to not get too nostalgic today. He'd probably want us to be, what was the term we talked about at lunch? Polish the democracy that we're committed to, and realize that we all have a role, very much like Dick did, to apply those principles and put them into action. So we're delighted to be here. Couldn't be more honored that the University of Pittsburgh is the home and the site of this amazing day. And finally, let me just say, I know Mark Nordenberg would have said all of this much better. And I know that he wishes he could be anywhere except at home convalescing, and he'd rather be here. And so please accept my regrets from Mark directly as well. With that, we'll turn this back to you, John. Thank you.
Now, this event is being live streamed, so Mark, we see you virtually, and thank you again. At this point, it's my great privilege to introduce our featured keynote speaker, the Honorable Andy Card, an esteemed American who has responded all throughout his life to the calling of public service. In his early years, he was a state legislator in Massachusetts, then went on to serve with distinction 3 U.S. presidents, first as Deputy Assistant to President Ronald Reagan, then Secretary of Transportation under George H.W. Bush, and then finally Chief of Staff to President George W. Bush. And in between all that has found other causes and callings. So we, like Dick Thornburgh, Andy Card always put his nation and his communities ahead of his own personal priorities. My father was honored to call Andy Card his friend. They both represent the greatest generation of public service. We're delighted that you can join us today, Secretary Card.
Thank you, John. Chancellor Gallagher, thank you. Ginny. I parked the car in Harvard Yard. My Boston accent may be a challenge to you every once in a while, so I apologize in advance. And I'm sorry Mark can't be here to join us today, but it's a thrill for me to be here. Dick Thornburgh was a remarkable person. His legacy is even more remarkable than him. I was running for the legislature in Massachusetts in 1972. I didn't win. I ran again in 1974 and did, and had the benefit of bumping into George Herbert Walker Bush when he was chairman of the Republican National Committee. He came to Boston to give a speech, and I was thrilled that I received a free ticket. That's because not many people bought tickets. And I remember him giving a speech that was very good in substance, not the best in delivery. But included in his remarks were commentary about some of the great Republicans that were around this country. And that was the first time I heard the name Dick Thornburgh. I then got very, very engaged in politics in Massachusetts, and getting engaged in Massachusetts politics is relatively easy. Being successful is really hard if you're a Republican. But I had lots of wonderful support, starting with my wife, Kathleen, who is with me today. But Massachusetts, as you probably know, has a remarkable transformation of leadership to a number of people who have served this country. Pennsylvania does too, and it has. Pennsylvania is the Keystone State. I'm an engineer by training. I'm a politician by disease, it's incurable, and I was an academic by accident. But the engineering background that I had is something that I'm very proud of, because engineers have to think logically. You design a building from the top down, you build it from the bottom up. And engineers know exactly what a keystone is. And a keystone is critical to keep a bridge from falling. The Keystone State had a remarkable keystone in Dick Thornburgh. And he was an engineer, so he knew how important a keystone is. He rose to the responsibility to make sure there were bridges where they should be, bridges where they needed to be, and that they didn't fall down. And it started with our democracy. He was the personification of the word "we" in the Constitution. He knew that the Constitution gives all kinds of rights and privileges, but the Constitution itself is an invitation. And he said he would answer the invitation. I'm not sure that his dad thought that he would answer the invitation. I'm not sure that when he was in engineering school at Yale that they thought he would answer the invitation. I think when he came to Pitt, he probably got a sense that he should answer the call and the invitation, and he ended up answering it. And he was very proud of that word, "we." He wasn't as forceful using the word "I." Instead, he made us all feel welcome and important, and that our voices were relevant, and our participation was invited. No one was excluded. It was the royal "we," and he was part of it. And he stood up and he ran for office, and he got frustrated. He got frustrated because it wasn't as logical as he thought it would be. But he also did the groundwork to make a difference. So when he ran and lost, he felt as if he was a winner because he got to learn more, he listened more, he cared more, and responded more. I first met him thanks to Elsie Hillman, and she was a force. And I met him through Elsie because of George H.W. Bush. And he was a force. And I remember being very impressed with Dick Thornburgh. First of all, I was impressed that Elsie was so impressed by him. And she picks winners. And she frequently found people that needed to be a winner and didn't think they could be. And she stood up for a lot of things that were pretty difficult to stand up for at the time. She was the Republican National Committee woman from Pennsylvania, and she was a force. And then there was, I'm going to say, a Dick Thornburgh, who said, things can be better in Pennsylvania. He was comfortable, but things could be better in Pennsylvania. And he ran for governor. And he got elected governor. And he surprised some people by winning that governor's race. But he came to office and he cleaned up government. I'm going to repeat that. He came to office and he cleaned up government. He also proved himself to be a leader not just for Pennsylvania, but a leader for other governors. You say, wow, there were some pretty remarkable governors at that period of time. Mario Cuomo, John Henry Sununu. There were a lot of very smart governors around the country, but Dick Thornburgh was the wisdom that the governors sought. So he was very, very, very influential at inviting governors to recognize their opportunities to build bridges. And it was Dick Thornburgh that made sure that every bridge had the keystone in it so that people could cross it and their lives would change. I remember him very well at National Governors Association meetings, and you'll hear from Ray Shapak, who ran the National Governors Association, about some of his work that inspired other governors and motivated them and helped find solutions. And these weren't Republican solutions or Democrat solutions. They were solutions. And Dick Thornburgh made sure that everyone understood the need to have a cornerstone for the bridge to be able to carry the burden of making a difference. What you may not know is Dick Thornburgh, and this comes because I was accidentally given an opportunity to serve in the White House. I say accidentally, it was never a plan. People don't talk about their failures in politics. I have to. I ran a forgettable campaign for governor of Massachusetts in 1982. I'd like to say I came in third in the Republican primary. My son, who was 7 at the time, yanked my pant leg the day after the election when I was thanking my workers. When I said I was proud of my third place finish, he said, "Dad, you came in last." I prefer to think of it as third. But I received a phone call that is really one of those invitations that Dick Thornburgh recognized in the Constitution. The we actually get invited to do things. We're invited to register to vote. We're invited to vote. We're not obligated to register, nor obligated to vote, but we're invited to. We're invited to run for office. We're invited to work for government. And I received a phone call from James A. Baker III, Chief of Staff to President Ronald Reagan. And he said, "Great campaign. Would you like to come work in Washington, D.C. for President Reagan?" And what a great privilege it was to accept the invitation, and what a thrill it was to drive your little red Chevy Chevette through the gates to go into the White House and get to the West Wing and have an office in the old executive office building. And what was my job? My job was to pay attention to Dick Thornburgh and all of the other governors. Special assistant to the president and liaison to the nation's governors and statewide elected officials. A nice long title. I learned that the longer the title, the less important you are. President, vice president. But that title gave me the opportunity to get to know Dick Thornburgh and all of the other governors. And Dick Thornburgh, he stood out. He was not boisterous. It wasn't about him. He didn't even seek the Klieg light. He knew how to handle it when it came on. But he was not full of himself. Instead, he was a listener. He was a learner. He was an educator. He was a leader. And I got to witness that firsthand as the governors dealt with very big issues. Very big issues with big personalities argue about them. And Ray Shapak will have more to say about some of that in some of the NGA meetings that took place. But it was a heady time, and Dick Thornburgh was steady. Yes, I remember 3 Mile Island. Dick Thornburgh, steady, an engineer, talking common sense, not with hyperbole, but reassuring support and confidence. His leadership in Pennsylvania was such that he did really clean house and polished the democracy of Pennsylvania so that others would be willing to answer yes to the invitation to serve. And there were a flood of people who said, "I want to follow Dick Thornburgh." And they did. But you also should know that what Dick Thornburgh was doing in Pennsylvania was known by other governors. It was certainly known by the people of Pennsylvania. It was really known in the Oval Office of the White House. Ronald Reagan liked Dick Thornburgh. I don't know this is in the public domain. I found it by reading the Reagan diaries. In April of 1987, Ed Meese went to the president, Ronald Reagan, and said, "I'd like Dick Thornburgh to be the FBI director." And the president said, "That would be great. I hope he says yes." There's nothing in the diary that says there was a yes or a no or anything else. I suspect that Dick Thornburgh said, "My job is in Pennsylvania." But anyway, I was thrilled to know that he'd been asked to be the FBI director. And that was 1987. And then 1988 comes along, and Dick Thornburgh becomes Attorney General of the United States of America. His record prior to that was exemplary. The House and the Senate reacted very well to the nomination. The Senate has the obligation to confirm, and they did. And cheers went up. And then I saw Dick Thornburgh change the way government worked. Why? Because he built bridges to people who needed help. And he made sure there was a good keystone that would keep those bridges up. First of all, he had the courage to talk to the president about things that the president didn't want to hear. Also in the Reagan diaries, it says that Dick Thornburgh came in and met with the president and said, "I don't want you pardoning anybody with Iran-Contra until we know what happened." That's not an easy conversation for anyone to have with the president. He did it. I watched him lead the Department of Justice to understand what incarceration meant and to make sure incarceration was not a violation. It was compassionate. Think about that. Is that a message that's usually given? No. But he gave the Department of Justice a greater conscience and reminded them that they're part of the we, just like we're part of the we. And then we change presidents, and George H.W. Bush becomes President of the United States, already a big fan of Dick Thornburgh. And he stays on as Attorney General. But it wasn't just staying on as Attorney General. It was staying on as someone who was a bridge builder to people who had needs. And bingo, what's he doing? He said, "We are a compassionate nation that is open for all, but some do not have the access that they need." And with tremendous spirit and an invitation that was very hard to resist, he said, "We need to change the rules about the way people with disabilities live." And Dick Thornburgh became a presence that caused everyone's conscience to be raised. And he helped lead an effort to get a coalition of people that could make it happen. And it was bipartisan. I'm going to say it was all-inclusive, and it was successful. One of the greatest civil rights acts passed in this country. And Dick Thornburgh made it possible. Now, he didn't do it alone, because Dick Thornburgh was not a do-it-alone person. He was always inviting others to be part of the solution, too. And that's what I loved about him. It wasn't I. It was always we. So I watched that happen. I can say I was very proud to be a bit player in the process. But I watched Dick Thornburgh. I admired Dick Thornburgh. I wanted to be Dick Thornburgh. And I respected the way he did it. And then, what happens? People say Dick Thornburgh gets things done. Everybody had something that they wanted to get done. And Dick Thornburgh was the one who answered the call. Maybe it was dealing with Dan Rather. Maybe it was dealing with the United Nations. Maybe it was dealing with Puerto Rico. Maybe it was dealing with helping people. And Dick Thornburgh said, yes, I'll do it. And he took on unbelievably challenging tasks that were not career tasks. In fact, some of the opportunities that he embraced would have been seen by others as career ruining. But he said, no, I want the truth. I want to help. I want to make a difference. And he did. So Dick Thornburgh's record of accomplishments is actually quite amazing. And guess what? It's not partisan. Yeah, he was a partisan, but he wasn't angry. He was inviting others who disagreed to educate him, but he would also solicit the opportunity to educate you, and he did it well. I was so blessed to be on the receiving end of his advice and counsel. Sometimes he would even call and solicit my advice and counsel. He was always welcome. He was needed. And I can tell you that presidents really respected him for his ability to be candid. You know, I'm a man of faith. My wife is a minister, a retired minister. And I'm always convicted when I think about the obligations people have who are, quote, in power. Ephesians 6:10 tells us, bad things can happen. And you have to be ready for bad things to happen. Our struggle is not against necessarily blood and death. It says in 6:10, it's the problem of rulers and authorities and powers. So we have to have the courage to stand up to them. And we're reminded that we should put on the belt of truth, put on the breastplate of righteousness, stand on with the gospel of peace, to take up the shield of faith, to hold everything off that's coming our way, to stand tall and put on the helmet of salvation, and to take up the spirit of the sword and pray in the Spirit with all kinds of prayers and requests. And to do that, Dick Thornburgh did that every day. Probably the most important duty is to put on that belt of truth. Dick Thornburgh stood for the truth. He helped uncover it. He helped us deal with it. And he did it the way an engineer would do it, by making sure the foundation of government was good and solid, making sure that the bridge to opportunities would stand for a long time, that keystone wouldn't fall out. And that's why the disabled community is so much better off today than it was. But think how better off it will be tomorrow because of Dick Thornburgh. So I celebrate the life of Dick Thornburgh. I miss him. Our democracy today, and Dick loved our democracy, is tarnished. And I don't say that as a partisan. I like to say when I got involved in politics, and I suspect Dick would say this too, the rug of American politics, when I got involved, had more rug than fringe. Today, it seems to have more fringe than rug. Dick Thornburgh would say, move to the rug. Recognize it that the fringe on the left is the same piece of fringe that's sticking out on the right, and they go through common ground. Dick Thornburgh fought to invite us to recognize common ground. So today, I think Dick would be saying, we have a job to do. We have a job to do. And that's to polish our democracy. Give permission to acknowledge common ground. Have the courage to move to it. Have the respect to listen. And the restraint by tasting your words before you spit them out. Licking your thumbs before you tweet them out. And avoiding the challenge that calls for us to be stuck on stupid. So I'm not sure Dick Thornburgh would have said, don't be stuck on stupid, but I think he might have said everything else that I said. But Dick Thornburgh, the truth is, never got stuck on stupid. Now, maybe it was Murray Dickman that made that happen, but I don't know. Maybe it was Elsie. Maybe it was Ginny. I don't know. But Dick Thornburgh gave us much. But the greatest gift that he gave us was his family. Because everyone in his family, they've got Dick inside of them. And he's the difference. And he made a difference in their lives. And you just watch all of those kids and grandkids. They're going to make Dick Thornburgh mighty proud. So with that, let's celebrate Dick Thornburgh and say thank you. And we've got work to do. Thank you very much.